Business owners of Reddit, what's the most obnoxious reason an employee quit had to be fired over? Pawn shop employee stole $400 from the cash register. Then realized that there were video cameras. He had no idea where the security footage was stored, so in order to cover his tracks he set the store on fire. He actually ended up getting pretty badly burned in the process and went to jail right after the hospital. I used to own a bakery and a woman quit because she blamed her yeast infection on a bad batch of yeast I bought from China. I may be a guy, but I don't think that's how it works. The company I work is a contractor for a giant corporation and we go to different stores to do work. This new guy we hired seemed normal at first, but it turned out he was a complete ducking idiot. So one day, he goes on site with one of the senior employees to shadow him. This genius thought that because we did work for the giant corporation we could just eat anything off the shelves and from the refrigerators free. Well, employee saw this and was like, WTF are you doing, you need to pay, and manager comes. This guy then started fighting with the manager, then got in his car after and drove off. Needless to say, his ass was fired the next day. I used to manage a store in the mall. One of my employees, I'm pretty sure, was cheating on her husband with a mall security guard. I would come by on my days off and he'd scurry out in a fluster. I never mentioned it, but the guy was coming by all the time to the point that it was keeping her from doing her job. Finally, we had a work meeting and I said in a very non-accusatory way, something like this: I know it gets slow in here during the week, and I'm guilty of it myself. But from now on I need everyone to keep personal visits to a minimum or during your lunch break. She stands up and starts screaming at me. How dare I accuse her? I'm Rick. She quits. She continued to call me and leave me harassing voicemail for a while too. Tool and die shop owner here. One of our machinists would go out for lunch and slam back 3-4 beers every day. When I found out, I told him he can't drink beer at lunch. He said it was his time and what he did at lunch was his business, not mine. The next day he came back from lunch smelling like beer. I let him go on the spot. A few years later he showed up in my office asking for his old job back. He said that he was an alcoholic back then and was sorry for his behavior. He was now sober and needed a job. I hired him on the spot and it worked out great for 5 or 6 years. Then he started drinking again and I had to let him go a second time. I have no idea how he is doing now, but I often wonder. He was a great machinist and a nice guy when he was sober. Woman was using company FedEx to deliver purses for her Red Sea shop. When you guys found out, you should have ordered a purse to the address of the HR department. Then just watch her panic in confusion. I worked for a boutique hotel, you know. Small, cute, expensive as an ops manager. Basically, unless the area manager had to come in, I was the law. I get a frantic call on my downtime from an employee claiming our overnight guy tried to assault him. I have a sigh, as the guy freaking out is notorious for being a drama queen. I load up the security camera on my home PC, go to the time frame, and holy shit. Our night guy legitimately lunged at his coworker and tried to strangle him. Luckily a desk was between them, and that gave the victim time to bolt. Instantly felt like a big dig for doubting him. Well, this is when I call in the area manager. We show up at the crack of dawn and speak with the dude who made the attack, and he claims he didn't do it. We show him the video, and I shit you not, he responds with, I don't recall the events of that evening. We fired him on the spot. What started the fight, you ask? Well, the victim had done extra work to make the attacker's shift easier. The attacker felt like this was an insult to his work ethic. Oh. And I got multiple reference requests from similar hotels asking for a good reference. I simply said I wasn't able to provide a positive reference, as legally that was all I could say. My wife and I started a small software company 20 years ago. She's the manager and does sales and HR. I do the programming. Anyway, we hired a programmer one time, and the first day on the job I spent the whole morning with him going over our development philosophy. how we do source control etc, and then showed him an overview of our applications and how we build them. Along the way he was highly critical, pointing out what he considered flaws in everything. After lunch he goes back in to see my wife. He obviously didn't know we were married. We don't share surname and at work we keep pretty much to ourselves. He says to my wife, you know how to fix this company? You need to fire that other guy. We still laugh about that one. We hired someone to do video photo media work. After a certain point he felt it was selling out and didn't want to do media commercially. He wanted to do business stuff. We asked him which role he would like. If he picked his role, we'd try it out. If he didn't, he would quit. He decided to quit. He couldn't come up with a role. What kind of work is it? Something about the way you worded that has caught my interest. Outdoors tourism. About a year ago, I hired a guy who was down on his luck. Went against my best judgment. Due to the nature of my business, I usually don't hire people that fit his profile, out of shape, poor hygiene, etc. It wasn't long before I started hearing complaints from female employees and clients. Turns out that he would often attempt to flirt with women, and when turned down, he would lose his mind and call them terrible names and insults. I don't tolerate that shit. So I gave him a very stern warning. The very next day, I found one of my sweetest female employees visibly upset. Upon inquiring, she said that the dipit had followed her home yesterday to make sure she got home safely, then showed up this morning to escort her to the office. She was genuinely scared. I called him into my office and told him to scram. He threatened to file a complaint with the Department of Labor for discrimination against men who have an innate need to protect women. Didn't matter. Told him to beat it. And now I'm fighting the stupid claim with the doll. I used to do some consulting work and hired a woman to help out. Mostly clerical stuff and whatnot. I flew down to St. Thomas for a meeting and got a call from Sunitral at 1:30 PM. She had keys to my building but didn't know about the alarm. Basically, she and her boyfriend brought another couple down to have a foursome in one of my offices I had converted to a bedroom where I could crash if I worked late. So I called her. She answered mid-coitus and acted normal, albeit a little tipsy. I talked about a few mundane details I needed to relate to her anyways, and then mentioned to make sure she only was ever at the office between 700 am and 700 pm, since there was a silent alarm that would call me with audio of activities in the building. When I got back in town her keys were sitting on my desk. I fired a guy because he said he couldn't come to work because it was raining and he had just washed his car the day before. I had an employee call off because it was raining and his car didn't have windshield wipers. That was a brand new excuse for me, so I let him have the day off. Once. Had a guy on a location fake an injury. Now mind you, he did injure himself severely accidentally. But that wasn't his plan. His plan had been to fake a minor injury and get put on workers' comp. The problem was he screwed up how to do it and ended up hurting himself severely. You ask, how did you know he was trying to fake injure himself? Well, that's very easy to explain. We had a 20-minute tape of him hiding behind one of the trucks on the work site practicing his fall. Then a written confession from friends saying that he'd been planning it since the day we hired him. Not my business but my dad's. He hired predominantly people with criminal records, and literally all they had to do was inspect rental cars for damage as the cars left the lot and keep their noses clean. You could do pretty much anything you wanted on your downtime with no complaints from my dad, as long as he didn't get any complaints from the owners of the car lot. One day one of the supervisors for the car lot I worked for walks out and asks me for my dad's number. Supervisor had caught a guy stealing gas from the property. He even had security camera footage of it happening. Dude was instantly fired. Not a business owner. But, at a previous job we had issues with food being stolen from the break room fridge. The company made a big stink about it and it kept happening, so they very obviously installed security cameras in the break room. Like big ducking cameras in plain sight. Pointing at the fridge. With our bosses being very direct about there is a camera. You really want to lose your job over eating someone's sandwich? Few days later, guy gets fired for stealing food. Literally on camera, just grabbing people's lunch out of the fridge and eating it. Don't own a business but work on employee claims and lawsuits. I've told this story on here before. A guy filed a discrimination complaint against the company after he got fired for stealing hot dogs from the refrigerator. This warehouse, big company, this was not at my location, kept a stock of hot dogs for employee appreciation picnics, usually weekly cookouts. No one knew why they were disappearing, so announcements were made and all employees were asked to not eat the hot dogs, and if they wanted some they could ask but couldn't have several packs. That didn't work, so warnings were announced. Finally a camera was installed near the refrigerator and he got caught red-handed. He was just practically inhaling the hot dogs directly from refrigerator by the packs. After he was fired, he filed a discrimination claim on the basis of disability due to his weight. I sent the response with a video of him eating the hot dogs. Also, he couldn't prove his weight was a disability under the ADA, and weight is not a protected class. We won that claim. Employee had corporate card, charged a vacation, purse, fossil watch, takeout, along with overall being miserable to work with. Had laptop stolen within weeks of joining. Fired her. And a few days later a watch catalog from Fossil showed up at the office with her name on it. Have active court cases for all the theft. Back when I had my translation business, I hired a guy to seek out contracts for me. I'd pay him 20% finder's fee. Instead of sending the finished project to a client, he accidentally sent naked pictures of himself. I learned of it when my client forwarded me the mail half an hour later, including the multiple glorious cockshots. I had a subcontractor on a job for my company try and convince the client that they should dump me and go with their business and they would undercut me by 10%. Learned this from the client, who asked me to find another person to service our contract. My parents got a quote on some plumbing work they needed once from a chain company, Roto-Rooter, I think, and they quoted some enormous fee in the high thousands. Then, individually, while one is talking to my mother and the other guy's talking to my father on a different area of the property, they each mentioned they run their own side business and could do the work for way less. I still wonder if they knew they were trying to undercut each other as well as trying to undercut their employer. My parents went with someone else. My dad owned his own business working as a color corrector editor. He had this one employee who had been there since day one and ended up becoming similar to an assistant manager. My dad owned that company for 10+ years, and just recently, he had to fire the assistant manager because apparently he was telling employees and customers that my dad hates gays, people who aren't white, his kids, his whole family, that he's a terrible person, etc. Basically driving all business away, pushing my dad's company towards bankruptcy. Turns out he was a narcissistic sociopath. My dad's just sad his employees never trusted him enough to tell him about what this guy would say to them. My dad and I ran a business together cleaning out foreclosed homes for a real estate agency as I was finishing high school. I was a senior, so I got out at lunchtime and we could usually get a house done in a half day. Sometimes we'd get some bad ones and we had a few guys that we would call to see if they wanted to make a quick $100 for a day's work. On my literal last day of class, my dad picked up one of our usual guys and got one house about 90% done by lunch. He was a pretty normal guy that we had never had any trouble with. The guy we paid to help my dad went out to the truck and came back into that house with a gun and robbed my dad of his wallet and took his keys and left in our truck. Funny thing is, my dad only had the cash he was about to give him an hour later for finishing up the house. The state police got the guy's number from us and they told him some bogus story about how my dad was being investigated for not paying his workers, and if met them with the truck they would get his statement and let him go. Idiot pulls up and gets arrested on the spot. He got 8 years in prison. I know somebody, they had to take a drug test, so he brought a little sample jar of drug-free piss with him. Went into the toilet, came out, gave the fake sample to whoever was doing the test and got fired on the spot. The sample was cold. Fresh piss is hot. I have experience with the drug testing, folks. I am amazed at the number of patients that don't realize temperature is practically the first thing they test. We had a young intern helping with some hardware inventory tasks. It wasn't uncommon for laptops not to make it back to us as projects would hoard them from terminated employees, but one day we noticed his backpack open and a laptop of a model we used sticking out. Sent him to the other side of the building and checked the serial number, and yep, it was one he reported as missing during a recent inventory. Opportunistic theft is one thing, but bringing it back into the office every day. Just wow. Not a business owner, but this happened to one of my co-workers. Guy was extremely nerdy. And this is from a self-admitting nerd. And absolutely obsessed with Pokemon, Magic the Gathering, and Yu-Gi-Oh! Literally the only things he would ever talk about. And would talk about them for as long as you'd let him. One day I'm on register and I see him being dragged out of the store by cops in handcuffs. Turns out he had been shoplifting tons of playing cards of those above listed games. At least $500 worth. As our store policy was to let an employee get away with it up to that amount before busting them. I think because the charges stick harder or something. Edit. See some people talking about theft categories and how they differ from state to state. If it helps anyone. This story happened in New Jersey. A new heavy mechanic was hired. Claimed to have prior experience. He was hired because he had a kid on the way and was in a bad spot financially, and the owners had a soft spot for unlucky people. Within a week his nickname was Almost. He almost did the work correctly. He almost rewired an electrical system. He almost rebuilt an air dryer successfully. He almost mounted tires. The probability of the part he rebuilt failing within a week was a solid 60%. By the end of week 2 it was clear most of his knowledge was book learned and not real world. They wouldn't let him do anything except change oil. Once his probation period was up and he showed no improvement or drive, they let him go. Trucks only make money when they move and he couldn't keep them moving. I'm not a business owner, but I'm a student manager. I don't really have the ability to fire someone. But I had to in this case. This one kid was trouble to say the least. And I asked him to go check the bathrooms to make sure they were clean stocked. When he asked about the woman's room, I said just to knock and make sure nobody was inside. Apparently he banged on the door and screamed. In his very deep voice. "WHO in here? Everybody get out." He then entered the bathroom where a poor little elderly woman was inside the stall. And continued to bang on the door yelling, "Get out." He was yelling so loud I actually heard him and went to investigate. The poor woman was whimpering and calling the police. And he just was the kind of person who had no idea how he came across. There was many weird issues, but this obviously topped the cake. And I told him he was done and needed to go home. The poor old woman was so upset that she refused to leave the bathroom and I had to call her son for her. I was hiring for a government contract that required everyone to be drug tested. I told the guy in the interview that he would be drug tested. Hired. Failed the drug test. Fired. When I told him he failed the drug test, he said yeah. I knew I would. Makes you wonder what he was thinking. Did he assume you were bluffing about the drug test? Or it would be delayed long enough that he could get clean? Or did he just want to get fired? I sold Kirby vacuum cleaners for a day. We drove around in a van and knocked at doors. The driver owned a franchise or something, so he would come in and close the deal. I sold one on my first day. I called him and he came in and asked the buyer if there was anything he did not like about the deal. Of course the buyer said that the price was a little high. So the franchise owner knocked off my whole commission. His reasoning was that if I sold a couple more I would be in some higher commission rate or something. I said duck that and took the tea home. Hounded him for weeks. He finally gave me the money after I showed up at his house at 1:30 AM. Duck him. What an asshole. I own a small business that I run, and one time this employee quit because he got bit by a squirrel that a customer threw at him. I had to fire someone for trying to start a console war with an 8-year-old who really liked Nintendo. While the former employee was a die-hard Xbox fan. He didn't even try to be playful about it. He was downright cruel to this poor kid. I had a duct tape wallet business in the 4th grade and hired classmates to sell for me. I fired one kid because he took my swing at lunch. At my old job, a grown-ass man quit. For the reason of the job was too hard. This was washing dishes at a breakfast place on a Thursday. Yet the 17-year-old kid does it with no itching.